Dr. Ard Louis, who's a professor of theoretical physics right here at Oxford. He leads an interdisciplinary research group studying problems on the border between chemistry, physics, and biology. You got to be pretty smart to do that. He's also director of graduate studies in theoretical physics. From 2002 to 2010, he was a Royal Society University Research Fellow at Cambridge and here at Oxford. Prior to this post that he has at Oxford, he taught theoretical chemistry at Cambridge, where he is also director of studies in natural sciences at Hughes Hall. He is also an associate of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. He's written for the Biologos Foundation, where he was on the board of directors. In 2013, he was elected a member of the International Society for Science and Religion. He was born in the Netherlands, was raised in Gabon. Is that how we pronounce it?
Yeah, fine.
Close enough. And received his degree, I'm an American, so and received his degree from the University of Utrecht and his PhD in theoretical physics from Cornell University. And most notably, he engages in molecular gastronomy in his free time. If you don't know what that is, join the club. I will ask him. I have some ideas, but please, a warm Socrates in the City, Oxford welcome to Dr. Ard Louis. Come on up. Thank you. My first question is, what is your story? How does somebody, you're born in Africa. Tell me about that and how you get to be here at Oxford.
So I grew up in Gabon in Central Africa, where my parents still live. My parents are biologists, so I grew up with a lot of science around. Grew up with had a pet chimpanzee as a child. Explains some of my behavior.
You grew up with a chimpanzee?
I did, yeah.
Haven't we all? No. Well, first of all, by saying that your parents are biologists, that doesn't really explain what you're doing in Central Africa. What are you doing? How does your family end up being in Central Africa?
So my parents wanted to do some kind of missionary work, having just come to faith a few years before as students.
Right.
And they went to teach at a school in the middle of the jungle, essentially. And then they stayed on. My father stayed on as a botanist. He's a plant specialist.
You're raised in the middle of nowhere, effectively. I mean, I've heard you say this, I guess, on a video or something. I was fascinated because you're describing a tremendously remote location.
Yeah, so we lived in a place where you'd have to drive half a day for the nearest town which had shops. And it was just kind of in the middle of nowhere. It was a school that the local villagers would send their kids to for secondary school. So the villages were off on waterways, not very easily accessible. So they would send, once the kids finished some kind of elementary education, they'd go there as a boarding school. So you grew up in the jungle, lots of food around in the forest, lots of animals. Very fun. I mean, for a kid, it's like heaven, basically.
And both your parents are biologists?
Yeah, they're both biologists, yeah.
That's extraordinary. So, I mean, you grew up in this environment of, obviously, faith, because they care about that, otherwise they wouldn't have gone there, and science. This is extremely rare in my understanding of the world. You don't typically find people who, first of all, in the world in which I live, there may be one parent who's a scientist, but for both parents, that's, it's pretty rare. But for them to also be motivated by faith and then to be serious scientists, it just seems like a fascinating environment. I mean, this idea that you're in the middle of the jungle in Africa and that you're growing up in an environment where faith is taken seriously, but your parents are both serious biologists. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like a kid's dream. I mean, to be in that sort of environment. It just seemed, to have a chimpanzee as a pet, that's not typical.
No, it's not typical. No, it was great fun.
You actually enjoyed being part of this community.
Yeah, I did, yeah. I felt very much part of the community.
Okay.
I felt very much like...
So did you know from when you were very young that you would be a scientist?
I didn't think about it too much when I was young.
Did you think everyone was a scientist?
I thought it was just a very ordinary thing because my parents were scientists.
Yeah.
There is a story my parents told me, I don't quite remember it, but apparently when I was in my teens, I told them I need to sit them down and had a very difficult announcement to make to them. And I told them I didn't think I was going to be a biologist, I was going to be a physicist. Wow. And I was sure they'd be very disappointed.
Yeah.
So I must have been wondering.
That's when parents know they've really failed. Yeah. When the kid doesn't want to be a biologist. Yeah. And what could be worse than physicist? That's just horrifying. Yeah, that's really sad. I hope my my daughter would never make such a claim to me. It's funny. I mean, it's serious because but it is also, of course, funny that you knew at a young age, okay, I have to tell my parents that I'm in love with physics.
Exactly.
Now, how does it come to be that? How old were you at the time? I don't know.
14, 15.
Okay.
Yeah.
How does it come to be that at that young age, you want to be a physicist?
When I first encountered physics, I just loved it. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I still think it's incredibly cool. So I just thought it was so fascinating that I thought it'd be amazing if I could do this for the rest of my life.
So far, so good.
So far, so good, yeah. Although I've moved into biology, so now I spend a lot of my time doing biological things. So that's why my parents have brought it up. Saying,
yeah, well, I want to get into
run,
that,
but you can't hide
and I want to get
this.
into the molecular gastronomy too, because I love anything interdisciplinary. I think that one of the difficulties of our age is people get so focused that they can't speak to people outside of their discipline. Sure. So I love that, and I want to talk to you about that. But okay, so you know early on that you have an affinity for physics. You want to be a physicist. What happens next?
Well, so I go to university.
Yeah.
I keep studying physics.
In Utrecht?
In the Netherlands, yeah. So I go back to the Netherlands, study physics.
Now, when you grew up, were you speaking Dutch at home?
Yeah, so we spoke Dutch at home, and it was a French-speaking country.
Yeah.
But I went to an English-speaking school for part of my schooling, so I had a bit of a mixture. And when we lived in the village, I also spoke a local language, but I've lost that. So.
What was the local language?
Banzabi, it's called.
Wow.
But I can just say hi now. It's kind of sad. I've lost it.
Well, it's amazing. But your parents are still there.
They are, yeah.
Gosh. You go off to university, and at that point, what was your ambition when you were an undergrad?
So I think my ambition was just to learn about physics. I wanted to learn. I thought it was really fascinating. I didn't know, I was hoping to have a career in it, but it's quite competitive, and I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to. So I kind of took it one step at a time. Mm-hmm. Did a PhD in the US. Really enjoyed that.
Oh, where?
In Cornell University.
I missed that. Yeah. It's not in my notes.
So then I went to Cambridge, and so just one thing kind of led to another, and I ended up as an academic. I mean, the interesting thing is that when you're an academic, right, you get paid money to think about things that you're interested in. In fact, it's other people's tax money, which I say thank you very much. And you're in some sense paid to think about what you think is interesting. A kind of curiosity-driven thing. Right. You may think that's odd, but most of our really great discoveries have come from that type of curiosity-driven research. So it's a great job. You're being paid to think about what you think is interesting. Mm-hmm. And there aren't very many jobs where that is the case, where you're basically given that kind of freedom to explore. So it's a great thing. I'm really, really pleased.
Right, and so now you've taught physics here, but you taught biology at Cambridge? Chemistry. Now, how's it possible? I mean, that's very impressive, the idea that you could be teaching at this level in those two disciplines. That's got to be a very rare thing.
Well, there's lots of places where they overlap, and once you know one, it's not that hard to learn the other one. So.
Okay, so it's not that big of a deal, obviously. Okay, so I'm not as impressed now that I understand it. All right, so in this rather rarefied environment here, teaching physics at Oxford, having taught chemistry at Cambridge, have you ever encountered, or do you typically encounter, or did you encounter when you were younger, a difficulty in reconciling your faith with science?
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes and no. So I think that when you study science, it's so beautiful and intricate and exciting that if you're a Christian, it strengthens your faith. You look at it and think, man, this is amazing. And there's something, so the content of the science, in some sense, attracts you towards God as a sense of worship almost. Right. So I've had that experience from the very first time I started learning science. I just thought it's amazing.
So as a kid?
Yeah, just the beauty of it. I thought, wow, that's really cool. So it's a bit like if you ask somebody when they go out into nature and they see these beautiful mountains, does that make them doubt their faith? Well, no, it doesn't. It's the opposite effect. So even though it's harder to explain to a layperson why it's beautiful, it's definitely at least as beautiful. It's the most beautiful natural scene. On the other hand, I think science has a kind of a psychology around it, a certain way of looking at things which can be very corrosive to faith. Yeah. And what I mean by that is, in science, I have a very particular way of thinking about the world, which is I look at things that are controllable and repeatable. Yeah. And that's very different in some sense from the way I might think about my Christian faith, because God might do stuff that's not controllable.
Right.
And so you can get a kind of way of thinking about the world that tries to put everything into boxes and tries to control everything.
Right.
Which I think it's more of a psychological state, and that can be quite different. I mean, it's actually also bad for interpersonal relationships. So, for example, the classic, let's say that your wife comes to you and says, I've got a problem. I don't know if I should choose A or B. And the scientist's answer will be, well, which is better, A or B? And if they're the same, that doesn't matter. And if one's better, choose A, one's better, choose B.
Right.
Well, that's a classic scientific argument. But that in personal relationships, that doesn't work because things are more complicated, more nuanced.
Right.
And so I think it's really that kind of psychological stance that can be corrosive to faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so it took me a while to realize that was what was going on. So I'd be spending all the time in science thinking in a very particular way about the world.
Yeah.
And I'd step out of it, and I'd have to broaden my horizons a little bit.
Yeah.
And
well,
that
but
was
I mean,
difficult.
I guess what I was talking about earlier about your parents. I mean, the idea that you grew up with very serious scientist parents who were serious about their faith. So in a way, they already modeled this idea that there's no division between the two, or there's no hostility between the two. That they are just different ways of looking at the world in a way, but not so different that they're opposed. They're not in different camps. They can be related. And I guess Francis Collins, he spoke at Socrates in the City some years ago, and he talks about how once he came to faith, what he saw as a scientist made him marvel at God. Yeah. And you don't hear that very often, but clearly...
You should hang out with scientists more.
Yeah.
Well, so clearly you don't hang out with scientists. Because
but I'm saying what I hear from scientists, part of what I'm saying is I mean, already, but there's a cultural narrative that has evolved, for lack of a better word, over the years, that has established this idea that there's a science culture, there's a scientific worldview that somehow actively excludes God, but historically that's not been the case. I know you studied the history of science, so tell us about that, because that's another thing that people may know a little bit about science, but typically we don't know much about the